Hi, I'm Jason Grindstaff, and welcome back. This is a follow-up video to our first part, which was looking at kind of an introduction to sport and exercise psychology. We're carrying on that discussion today, and we're going to be looking at our final two objectives. Remember from the first video, and if you didn't get a chance to watch it, go back and watch it, because in that video we reviewed what is sport and exercise psychology. We looked at kind of the two primary objectives of this academic discipline and the professional study and application of that knowledge. We looked at what are the various roles of sport and exercise psychology specialists, and then we also looked at kind of distinguishing between those specializations. So what do the performance enhancement specialists do versus more the clinical specialists? In this second video, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to really drill down into these final two objectives. We want to be able to discuss issues relevant to the connection between science and practice. And then finally, we want to look at some of the ethical considerations in not only how we study and research sport and exercise psychology, but how we apply that knowledge. If you remember from that first video, when we were defining sport and exercise psychology, Gould and Weinberg said that it's the scientific study. So we didn't really kind of tease out what we meant by the scientific study. And again, Weinberg and Gould mentioned that science of sport and exercise psych, it's really a process or method of learning about the world through the systematic, controlled, empirical, and critical filtering of knowledge acquired through experience. So really here, our four key components. We need to define systematic, controlled, empirical, and the critical filtering. So when we say that, or we run across this term systematic, well, what do we mean? It really involves the standardizing of conditions. So in essence, for example, if we have an experimental design, we might have multiple groups. That could be a component of systematic. Science is systematic in the sense that there's a scientific method. We're going to go over the scientific method here in just a moment, but it's a step-by-step process for developing an idea, and then how we test the feasibility of that idea, or test that hypothesis. There's a systematic process there. The second component is that it's controlled. There are key variables in a study, and these are evaluated and need to be considered when focusing and determining a study, while other variables might be excluded from a study. So for example, we just mentioned maybe we have an experimental design in a study, and we want to look at a particular treatment. So that experimental group might get the treatment while the control group does not get the treatment. Our third component of science is that it's empirical, meaning that it's based on observation as compared to simply using introspection or intuition as far as what we think might work. And then our final component is it's the critical filtering of knowledge. And what we mean by critical is that it involves rigorous evaluation. So before we ever get to a theory in sport and exercise psychology, there have been multiple studies that have built on one another. And so that is a critical process over that time, the rigorous evaluation of one study and how that leads to the next study, which leads to the next study. So any one single study in of itself doesn't produce theory. It's the accumulation and the evaluation of that body of knowledge over time that allows us to eventually build theory. And we'll get into theory here in just a moment. But a word on kind of the idea of this goal of sport psychology. So when we talk about, what are sport and exercise psychology consultants attempting to do in that scientific process? Well, again, we do want to describe, want to explain, predict, and we want to be able to modify or control behavior. And all of this leads to the development of theory. Just like any other discipline, whether we're talking about sociology or physics or business, there are theories in each of those disciplines. Sport and exercise psychology uses theory in order to be able to inform practice. So theory informs practice. Weinberg and Gould point out that theory is a set of interrelated facts presenting a systematic view of some phenomena in order to describe explain, and predict its future occurrences. Theory is really critical because it provides a framework for asking questions, how to measure data when that question is asked, and then how to apply that knowledge. So really, in short, theory and the study of those theories provides validity to interventions used in the practice of sports psychology. A good example of this from social psychology is Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which suggests that although learning is a highly cognitive process, it occurs in a social context. Meaning that humans have the capacity to learn from one another through observation and instruction. And there's a really great study on this in the early 1960s, where actually Bandura and some of his colleagues set up Bobo dolls, and more infamously, this is called the Bobo doll study. But in short, the purpose of that study was to determine the effects of observed aggression on childhood behavior. So for example, they had a group of children play in a room, and if you remember back to Bobo dolls. So here you have this inflatable doll that has a heavy weight in the bottom. And if a kid punches or kicks that Bobo doll, it's going to go backwards and then it's going to pop up. Well, what they did in this Bobo doll study is they would have a group of kids in a room and maybe one kid who displayed aggression by beating up on this Bobo doll. What would that do to the other kids, or what effect would that have on the other kids in the room? And what Bandura and his colleagues found was that when other kids who maybe didn't have aggressive tendencies observed another child displaying these aggressive acts, they in turn took on those characteristics and displayed more aggressive behaviors. So how might this apply to sports? So let's assume for a moment that we're a group of researchers interested in setting up a study or an experiment where one group of kids watches videos of professional hockey players, highlight videos of professional hockey players fighting, while another group of kids just watches highlight videos without any violence. The kids could then be placed into game situations where maybe we as the researchers record the number of aggressive behaviors for both kids from each of those groups. So based on Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, what group of kids do you think would exhibit more of the aggressive acts? So that's kind of a question that sports psychology researchers might ask, and how we might use theory to then develop a study and predict a hypothesis and then evaluate those observations. So as we mentioned, the science of sport and exercise psychology, it is a systematic, controlled, empirical, and critical process, which involves the scientific method. Now, based on other classes that you might be taking, maybe in biology or in psychology, there's a different number of steps to the scientific method. But regardless, if you're following a 5-step or a 6-step or a 7-step scientific method process, the essence is still the same. We start with a question, something that we are interested in knowing more about. We do the background research, and based on that background research, that review of the literature, we're going to determine some sort of a working hypothesis, or what we think might happen. We then set up some kind of a study or an experimental design. Out of that design, out of that study or the experiment, we collect some kind of data. We're going to analyze that data. We're going to interpret that data, and then we're going to formulate some sort of conclusions based on those findings. As we've been talking about the science of sport and exercise psychology, you've heard me toss out two key terms: studies and experiments. In a study, this is where the investigator or the researcher observes or assesses, but without changing the environment in any way. Studies can be done in much more naturalistic settings where they don't have to interfere with the participants. But the ability to control a study and through that empirical process is somewhat limited. So we also have experiments, and this is where the investigator or that researcher manipulates or controls for particular variables while observing them, and then examines how those changes or that control in one or more of the variables affects some sort of an outcome. So what might that look like? Well, in the simplest form in an experiment, we might have two groups, where one group in that experiment is going to get the treatment, and another group is not going to get the treatment. We're going to call that our control group. And because we have those two groups, that all conditions being the same except for one group is getting the treatment, then we can more precisely and critically determine, based on the outcomes, did the treatment have the effect that we thought it was going to have. All right, let's talk a little bit about the role that ethics play in the profession of sport and exercise psychology. There are a number of reasons why studying ethics is critically important. The most important reason why is because we want to do no harm by those that we work with. So the $10 term there is beneficence. We want to make sure that we're not putting anybody in harm's way, physically or and emotionally. As well, we want to ensure that we're providing good, competent, and quality services to those that we work with. So we need to be reputable professionals, have the proper training and education to provide those services. And then third, I think ethics help guide our professional decision-making process, especially in those situations where the right decision is really difficult or at best ambiguous as far as what we should do. So maybe let's look at an example. Let's say that you're the coach of a team and you're getting ready to head into postseason play. You're getting ready for conference, and the best player on your team has missed curfew multiple times. When in the past, repeat offenders on the team have been held out from the next competition. So in this case, you're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. What's the ethical dilemma here? What's the right decision to make? So there are particular ethical standards for sport and exercise psychology consultants, these professionals that work in the field, and there's actually 6 of them. So let's walk through. None of them will tell us exactly what the right decision is. For example, our coach who's heading into postseason play, but they help provide a framework or a guide to help get to the best decision possible. And that's oftentimes very context specific. So the first one, competence. We want to make sure that that we have extremely high standards of knowledge for what we need to know, and that encompasses both the training and the experience that professionals need to have in order to go out and present yourself as a competent professional, but then also know what your limits are, the bounds or the scope of your practice. We don't practice outside of those limits. The second being integrity. You need to be able to clarify your role and not falsely advertise yourself. So, for example, if I'm a sport and exercise psychology consultant and I specialize in helping athletes recover from athletic injuries, psychologically recover, I don't get into and design and facilitate those rehab programs, the physical rehab. I know that that's not my scope of practice. So I need to have the integrity to advertise myself as a sports psychology consultant who primarily specializes in mental rehabilitation. The third component of ethical standards is that professional and scientific responsibility, to always place the interests of the client or the participant, the subjects in our study first. And we just mentioned that before with this concept of this idea of beneficence. Fourth is respect for people's rights and dignity. People have fundamental rights. If we're talking about research, for example, if we're going to be an ethical researcher, if somebody starts a study with us, they have every right to discontinue participation at any point during the research process. If we're talking about people's rights in the consulting process, confidentiality is key. So what we talk about in the context of our performance enhancement sessions, that I, as the sports psychology consultant, is going to respect that confidentiality of the client and not go back and share that information with that athlete's coach or athletic trainer unless that athlete gives me permission. Concern for the welfare of others. We're always trying to contribute to the welfare of those that we work with and around. And then finally, social responsibility. Here we're trying to contribute to the welfare of society as a whole. So if we as a sports psychology practitioner, researcher, teacher, whatever our role might be, if there's a social injustice that's occurring, we have a right and a responsibility to speak up and bring attention to that issue. So in this video, what we've done we've covered 6 learning objectives in the first video. Hopefully we were able to clarify the first 3 or 4 of those objectives. And then finally in this last video, what we just did here, we really discussed the concept of science and the practice of sports psychology, as far as how theory is developed. And then we also finished up with a discussion on ethical considerations and how we make ethical decisions from the standpoint of 6 particular principles that we follow. So hopefully that was a good introduction to you on sport and exercise psychology, and we'll look forward to in future videos getting into some of the other chapters in the textbook.